watched the surface, your stillness, your retreat, your quiet absence from their noise. They confused that for surrender. They clapped in whispers when you slipped out of the spotlight, when you stopped defending yourself, when your presence faded from their stories. They told themselves it meant you were finished. But beneath that surface, beneath the fragile belief that you had walked away, something far more dangerous was awakening. You weren't hiding, you were charging a new version of yourself, one that wouldn't beg to be seen, one that memorized every wound and turned it into an architecture for a future that didn't look like revenge. It looked like rebirth. And then, just when they were drowning in false certainty, you returned, not with noise, but with control. That's what turned it into power. You designed it so they never realized, until the outcome was already inked into the moment. You designed it so they never saw it coming. You didn't roar when they twisted your name. You didn't gather banners to prove them liars. You observed. You traced their habits. You heard what they refused to say. You noticed the silence of those who stayed mute while your name was soiled. You didn't hold grudges as notes. You carved a strategy. You learned that the sharpest reply is sometimes no reply at all until the silence grows unbearable. Then, when the moment demanded it, you didn't return with rage. You returned with evidence, the kind of evidence that closes mouths forever. Your shine became the witness, your triumph the sentence. You let your absence be the trap, and your arrival the gavel. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about proof. Proof through elegance, through distance, through clarity. The sharpest strike you made wasn't rage. It was precision. You didn't respond recklessly. You calculated. Every step forward was measured. They never realized you were playing strategy while they were screaming into shadows. They thought your quiet meant weakness, but your quiet was a vault. Recording, decoding, constructing. When you stepped back into view, everything about you was sharpened. Even your stare. It didn't beg for approval. It dissected intent. They froze, unsure how to fight someone who didn't require their recognition, their gossip, their energy to matter. You inverted the balance by refusing to dance in their circus. When they threw bait wrapped in rumors, you disappeared. When they spread chaos, you stayed still. When they raised flags for war, you declined the invitation. You understood what they never could. Real power does not answer noise. It lets the fire consume itself and builds kingdoms from the embers. That's what you did. While they shouted about importance, you forged yourself, again in silence, not as a counter to them, but as a horizon they would never step into. Their end was written inside your beginning. Their mistake wasn't misreading your anger. It was misreading your design. They assumed you would storm back with rage and thunder, with shouting contests and open wars. But you returned with space, and space, when held with precision, is destructive. You weren't pleading your side. You were standing as evidence. And when the room finally noticed, when they saw the one they dismissed, now untouchable, their illusion collapsed. Not in noise, but in silence. Like truth revealed too late. You stepped beyond their battlefield. That was your sharpest strike. You walked away not as a casualty, not even as a survivor, but as something else, something risen. That's the outcome that haunted them most, your refusal to rot in the cage they created. They armed for anger. They were unarmed for your rebirth. And when you entered, not begging for space, but laying your own foundation, that's when the lesson landed. Power doesn't wait politely, tears down the frame. You didn't return to belong. You returned to erase their system. Mentally, it was flawless. You refused to feed the loop. You refused to let their chaos command your pulse. You mastered detachment. And in doing so, you redrew your place in every circle. No longer the wounded one. You became the riddle, the figure who doesn't explain, the one who vanished, rebuilt, and appeared again with such undeniable presence that voices lowered when you arrived. You turned patience into a blade. That's why it was dark. Not because it was cruel, but because it was exact, slicing without a single strike. They believed they held the advantage. They believed their version of the tale would live forever. But here's what tales do. They decay. And the longer you remain silent, the faster they're spoiled. Cracks spread. Energy flipped. Questions started echoing. Doubt crept in. And all you did was keep moving, keep shaping, keep rising until one day the story broke apart. And the only figure unshaken was you. Not because you battled harder, but because you endured past their every definition. You see it clearly now. The pause in their greetings, the strain in their chatter, the tremor hidden in their laughter. That's the cost when the one they buried returns with proof, with presence, with poise. You became the ghost of every lie they created, the echo they can't outrun. Because now, in every space they enter, your silence is louder than their shouts ever were. That's permanence, that's command, that's the darkest strike of all. Not in destruction, but in replacement. You didn't chase revenge. You became the truth that reveals them in every gathering. That's the cruelty of evolution. Less about dramatic punishment, more about being the reminder itself. You didn't accuse, you didn't shout, you shifted the measure. And now every room you step into becomes a stage that burns away their disguise. Inadequacy, your steady breath in a storm-filled boardroom, your composed tone in a corridor dripping with whispers, your subtle nod in a circle thick with chaos. Each one echoed against the walls, exposing the fractures they prayed you'd ignore. You became the clarity they lacked, and when the dust settled, the only thing visible was their disorder. No accusation spoken, only your presence. And under that weight, they unraveled. They built their strongest illusions on, shouting on schemes, on counterfeit charm, but your presence didn't validate or deny, it uncovered. The contrast between your steady, calm and their frantic spirals tore through their masks in every room after. You became the measure. Do they carry composure, depth, integrity, or do they replay the same failures they rehearsed with you? That silent question pierced deeper than conflict ever could. You proved that character outweighs performance, and now every word spoken near you is weighed. That's not revenge, that's transformation. Distance turned into a lens that rewrote the laws of engagement wherever you stood. Psychology calls it priming. You primed the setting. You taught the room what behavior endures under your gaze and what collapses instantly. The brilliance they never noticed. They entered new arenas, still carrying the residue of exposure near you. It altered their tone, shifted their rhythm, reset their limits. And if they couldn't rise to that measure, if they failed to bear the integrity you required, they betrayed themselves. Again and again in public, in power, in private, they repeated the same cracks. Not because they were predictable, but because they refused to adapt. And by then, you had already reset the ground they walked on. That's the true strike, not retaliation, but rewriting the field. When you leave, it isn't absence. It's a vacuum of awareness that scrubs the space. They feel your exit. They feel the standard you left behind, and they carry it into every circle as if it never left. It forces them to rise, higher or fall harder. But either way, your influence cannot be escaped. You became their orbit, not by force, but by constancy. The weight of standing near you after once crossing your boundaries. They taste it. They choke on guilt or swallow truth every time you appear. That is the condition. Correction without effort. You taught by silence. They may call it cruelty. They may call it pride. That's part of the fracture. Let them whisper, thinking you won't hear. Then enter any space, any circle, and watch them stall. Not because you threaten, but because you contain. Because true dominance isn't about striking, it's about shaping the air. You stopped being a player. You became the standard. And now anyone beneath it looks like they never belonged.
That realization burrows beneath their skin. It fractures their certainty. It becomes, in its own devastatingly silent way, vengeance, a slow-burning exposure that never needed flame. Let's revisit psychology, impression formation, social comparison. People instinctively measure themselves against a standard. You live by one, so high, so unspoken. It seeps into them unnoticed. They cannot rise. They cannot rest. They wrestle with the weight of your measure. You never beg applause. You never demand obedience. You simply exist, and that existence pierces holes through their contradictions. Every room you enter becomes a confession booth. They carry old reactions to you like scars, and then stand beside your light, realizing those scars cut deeper than they imagined. That is the power move, a permanent recalibration of acceptable behavior. You became the ruler, without measurement, intimidating for nothing more than being. You never raised your voice. You raised the bar. That was enough. Revenge dissolves. Standards remain. They endure. They sculpt tomorrow. You didn't topple them. You made them see they would collapse alone. In every room, every tale, every quiet second, you turned your presence into an exam they never requested. Your presence is the exam, and when you return to a school, a workplace, a gathering, you don't just walk in. The atmosphere bends. People pause. They measure. They hesitate. That bend cannot be hidden. That bend is you. It's darker than revenge. It's evolution. Now they dread your nearness, not because of confrontation, but because of exposure. They know they've once fallen beneath your standard. Now they fear they'll repeat it. They fear their roles unraveling, their image crumbling, and you never utter a word. The condition you embody binds them each time. That fear is silent, steady, unrelenting. unrelenting, is the echo of your strike. It trails them from chamber to chamber, from doubt to doubt. That is legacy disguised as silence. You let them savor control, then walked away holding everything they swore you lost. That's the twist. The master stroke hidden in restraint. They built the board, they placed the pieces, and you moved exactly as they staged. With practiced patience, smile, nod, seem loyal, seem small. They reclined, certain they'd reclaimed the throne. What they never grasped was that they gifted you the keys to dismantle their illusion, all while believing they still commanded the game. The oldest predator's tactic: blend, fade, let them breathe easy, then strip away all they thought they'd stolen. They tracked your silence like hunters, convinced you were prey once you shrank. They believed the floor cleared the moment you no longer stood on it. They spread tales of your downfall in hushed corners and gossip chains. They chuckled at your supposed weakness, sure you had surrendered. They casually attached your name to failure. You allowed them to shape that story. You let their arrogance swell because it served you. The deeper they sank into their fiction, the sharper the collapse would strike on your return. And you knew illusions thrive best when unopposed, so you let them spread when they tossed your image back into the crowd. They believed you'd be shattered. They expected amplified disgrace, recontextualization, but you never took to the stage. You never exposed them outright. You never crafted essays or mourning tributes. You simply rebuilt yourself into a presence so refined, so unshakable, that every space you stepped into began to murmur your name in awe. They had predicted a weak comeback, maybe rage or pleading. You gave them something else in age. Quickly your rise stopped being tied to the past. They forgot the image of you, broken, and they feared how far you'd risen in silence. Each handshake, each glance, every handshake now carried more gravity than when you once fought to be noticed. People regarded you differently. Courtesy turned into reverence. Gates swung open without your knock. Discussions shifted. The second you entered, they thought presence required volume. You understood it, lived in restraint, in the one who never needs to speak. And while they believed they dictated the story, you carefully curated your world. You didn't aim to disprove them. You stripped them of relevance. Psychologically, this is the art of recontextualization. Let them witness you once in weakness, and then meet you again in power. The mental fracture they endure is not mere tension, it is shame. They expect your ruin to mirror their version. When it doesn't, they scramble for reasons, for edits, for blame. But the gap between what they claimed and what you embodied is exquisitely unsettling. That is your strike, not the public clapback, but the quiet echo of your aura in rooms they once believed were theirs. They now cling to your absence. They count the days you skip meetings. They falter when no reply arrives, because your steadiness once tempered their chaos, and now restored, they see the ground has dropped without you. Here's the twist: while you walked away with everything, their attention, their respect, their quiet, they're the ones now haunted by what slipped. With no spectacle, no uproar, no flame, you advanced, and that haunting silence, that is the loudest declaration. Let them whisper about your ghost. Let them pretend you vanished, because vanishing transforms into legend when what lingers is evidence. In textbooks, ghosts are studied. In reality, ghosts appear when their affairs brush against your reach. You never show, but history does. You didn't smash the design. You rewired it as they slept inside, and each structure you touch resets into order. They finally see how fractured it was and mourn the architect they once dismissed. You turned the table, not in plain sight, but in the shadows. You built anew. You dismantled every assumption of who they thought you were. They believed they had trapped you inside your old reputation. You turned it into the bedrock of an empire rising above their heads. They spin tales of your exit as if leaving was surrender, but leaving was the strike, because you departed with your pride whole, your integrity unbroken, and your blueprint preserved. And they didn't even realize its worth until it was beyond their grasp. It's poetic. They schemed to strip you of status, of identity, of recognition. You let them believe they succeeded. You let them celebrate your ruin. Yet all the while you were constructing a myth they couldn't even see, one forged in restraint, in patience, in discipline, in silence. Refusal to play a role in their script. Refusal to bow to a narrative not authored by your hands. You became the unspoken measure they cannot surpass. And every arena you enter transforms into a silent mirror, reflecting their delusions. Now when they attempt their attack, cracks, they hesitate before they whisper, because you walked away with far more than dignity. You walked away with sovereignty. Sovereignty over your story, sovereignty over your timing, sovereignty over who earns a place near you. And when you reappeared, it was as untouchable. They thought they'd stolen everything you were. All you needed to preserve was the one thing they could never reach, your essence. And as that dawns on them, silence becomes your crown. You required no vengeance. You became the atmosphere that reveals their true form, the line between who you are, underweight, and who they become in your absence. You never needed to retaliate. Their paranoia did that for you. The void carried your answer before you spoke. Your silence, the air you left behind. You knew what they hadn't yet grasped. That silence, deliberately wielded, invites collapse. You didn't shout because chaos multiplies best when left alone. You watched as they scrambled to fill the emptiness, fabricating rumors, bending minor gestures into betrayals. They lashed at shadows because they mistook silence for weakness. What they missed was silence, when crafted with precision, becomes the sharpest weapon of control. Their unease echoed your strength back at them. In every nervous glance, every broken tone, every doubt whispered under breath. They condemned themselves, and you never had to intervene. They mistook your quiet for retreat. They believed your patience was fatigue. They never saw that every pause was strategy, every absence a design. In the art of your return, they conspired. They speculated. They recited rumors as truth. But the void you left wasn't emptiness, it was a stage, and an absence outshines presence. When the world stares at the empty chair, asking where did the force go, they crumbled beneath their own questions. They became actors in your story, and that story declared by default your invincibility, because the only defense you had to raise was none. Their own fear carved the throne beneath your legend. You didn't send messages. You didn't craft justifications. You didn't shout into hollow temples of attention. You vanished. That's when it shifted. Gossip mutated into monsters of their imagination. The empty chair became a symbol of victory. The unanswered calls became proof of guilt. The quiet became proof of collapse. But quiet also resembled authority. They couldn't untangle the difference. You dissolved only to ascend higher, and their anxiety painted your horizon for you. They constructed the frame of your return. They whispered fables that stirred curiosity, then dread. You didn't write it. They did, and that was the elegance. You let suspicion rot the spaces they once ruled. Now, when they step in, their breath shortens, not because you're present, but because you could arrive. They recall your composure. They recall the way you didn't drown in storms. They fear your absence, your echo, your ghost, before your form crosses the threshold, and so they unravel early. They overcalculate, second guess, rearrange, collapse. They move like prey cornered by their own doubts. You freed yourself from defense by making them prisoners of insecurity, and every stumble betrays them because power arrived without invitation, and they can't adapt to one who ignores their chaos. Psychology reminds us people react less to reality, more to what they assume reality means. When you don't engage, assumptions spiral like ivy, and ivy spreads fast. It strangles, it smothers logic. Their unease became their executioner. They tried to patch silence with tales, and those tales built your foundation. They constructed the platform beneath your feet, and when you emerged again, the crowd already had the script, the rise of the silent victor. You didn't plan it, but you claimed it, because you knew this. As Lawrence said, the art is in making them see what isn't shown. You refined that. You never sparked the blaze. You just left them blind and let their eyes ignite. They call it plotting. They can call it deception. But truth is colder. They screamed. You stayed still, and screamers tremble when stillness answers back. That trembling authored a script they cannot erase. They think they're directing the tale, but fear is the string in their song. Your silence is the refrain, and together it is brilliance. They built the theater. They delivered the drama, and when the curtain rose, you didn't bow. They'd already applauded in fear. That was your silent strike. You let them fight shadows, and they fought with everything. Now watch how they stumble, how their confidence fractures when you take your seat beside them.